Thanks, Alessia and Chiara, for this invitation. I'm really happy and honored to be here and to give this last keynote speech about the tourism of the beaten tracks. I've been working on this tourism of the beaten tracks for the last years, and I have the feeling that most I work on this, the less I know, and most I work on tourism, the less I work on tourism. So I would like to share these questions with you, and obviously I will ask much more questions than I will give answers, but I will try to give some answers if the time allows me. So this growth for alternative tourism practices and alternative tourism products is highlighted by several researchers in tourism or urban studies in Paris, in London, in Berlin, and in other places. I just give some references here. The dominant model of mass tourism, yesterday we had some slides on Barcelona, and these pictures are for Barcelona. So this dominant model of mass tourism is increasingly and strongly challenged by more composite, more diverse, and more individualized tourism offer. This is, of course, to link with changes induced by globalization, by metropolization, by individuation, or by the hybridization of lifestyles. And a new attention is given to the ordinary, to the everyday life places, to the contextualization of the accommodation, to social interactions, to authentic experiences, authentic between brackets, of course. As this is evidenced by the development of the phenomenon of greeters. You know about greeters, these volunteers that offer visits in their neighborhoods, or the phenomenon of couch surfing. So tourists are invited to get off the beaten tracks, to transcend the socio-temporal framework established by commercial tourism actors, providers, in order to venture into spaces and places not yet used by the tourism industry. And these new tourism offers meet, in fact, the demand, the practices, and also the imaginaries of tourists. This offer and demand of off-the-beaten-tracks tourism tends, I think, to dramatically renew the tourism system, its practices, its stakeholders, its spaces, its temporalities also, and its forms. Alternative tourism, participatory tourism, slow tourism, creative tourism, suburban tourism are some of the words that refer to these new approaches to tourism. These new tourism forms design new relationships between centers and peripheries, but also between tourism practices and everyday life practices, between proximity and remoteness, between exotic and familiar. So the established tourist categories become more and more blurred, uncertain. They are produced and consumed in contexts much more difficult, in fact, to identify, to describe, to qualify, to quantify than it used to be in the past. And I think that they really represent a challenge for tourism studies because they contest even the basic definition of what tourism is. They are more porous, less strictly localized in time and space, and of course they modify tourism destinations and tourism understanding. And they invite us, I think, to renew the analysis of the tourism phenomenon as an object and as an object of study per se, but also in terms of the place that tourism occupies in contemporary societies in a more general way. So obviously, questioning the established lines of demarcation between official, we would say, tourist places and other places, between the sites and the ordinary city spaces, introduces several, I think, new questions about the nature, about the forms, about the spatial distribution of tourism in an urban or a suburban context. These evolutions, in fact, change the established tourism geography, if any, as more and more backstages become front stages. As early as 1985, Maxine Pfeiffer proposed the concept of post-tourist. Post-tourist who is supposed to build his or her personal experience by subjectively collecting fragments of different products offered by the tourism industry and by reconstructing them according to his or her own choice. The post-tourist is aware, in a kind of reflective way, of the built nature of his or her role without, in fact, trying to challenge it. For Eric Cohen, yes, the post-tourist, instead of being interested in the origins of the supposedly authentic attractions, prefers to surf ironically and playfully on the surface, in fact, of things, and on the surface of clearly, sometimes, inauthentic experiences. Far from sensing different experience from those of his everyday life, he may choose, in fact, to visit familiar or mundane places. So according to Eric Cohen, unlike modern mass tourism, tourism which is attracted by the sights, post-tourism critically questions the uniqueness of the visited places and appreciates these places of everyday life. Jean Viard considers that post-tourists are attracted by environments that are not, or at least not only, recognized as typically touristic. So my presentation today aims at examining the practices, the productions, and the tourist imaginary of this tourism of the beaten tracks. I will try to examine the ways through which new tourist territories, new practices, new mobilities, new products, new temporalities take place in these interstitial spaces, dramatically changing the way tourism develops in these urban or suburban places that I will try to present. And the question that I would like to ask is if off-the-beaten-track tourism is a symptom of a generalized post-touristic state, or if we can eventually give another answer to this question. Okay, let me first try to deconstruct, in fact, this tourism of the beaten tracks. Obviously, the willingness of the tourists to escape from the commercial tourism framework in which they are often assigned by the tourism industry, their will also to discover the backstage, the other side of the mirror, is as old as tourism itself. It is, I think, necessary today to understand why the situation is probably different. So what are we speaking about tourism of the beaten tracks? This term, this concept of the beaten tracks is used to describe very different, very heterogeneous, in fact, kinds of places. It may concern very distant, very exotic, very unattainable places, places that they are supposed to have been remained virgin of the presence of tourists, but it can also, in fact, concern places like the one I show in this slide here, everyday life places that are offered, in fact, for the first time to the visit of tourists. The work of an urban economist, Robert Maitland, who has been working on these issues for the last years, in particular in London, and more precisely in Islington, Bankside, and Spitalfields, Maitland highlighted the attractiveness of places of everyday life, and even also places disadvantaged, poor, and marginal. Maitland qualifies these places as heterogeneous as opposed to tourist enclaves. While a tourist enclave place is supposed to be clean and controlled, an heterogeneous tourist space is a place in which creatives mingling with one another, so a place in which we find a high concentration of creative industries in one area, complemented also by creatives as visitors, also a setting in which we have an inspiring style codes and fashion, and where visitors can draw inspiration for their own creative outputs. An image of uncontrived, unexpected, unplanned, explorable place. Also a place in which you may have safe danger. Safe danger means a feel of edginess, but at the same time a very controlled, in fact, danger. A place also in which you may have cultural diversity, and, well, including ethnic food and shops, and also the feeling that when you visit these places, you are an insider, that you are in insider places and not really tourism presence. So these characteristics here are obviously clear, and we can, all of us, I guess, here imagine the places they are describing. I think, however, that it would be a mistake to consider that tourism of the beaten tracks is a kind of analytical category. It seems to me necessary to consider it, in the opposite, as an object of study. So instead of considering of the beaten tracks as a deterministic category of tourism, I rather suggest to analyze it as a complex system of places, actors, and practices which are socially, culturally, and historically situated. In this sense, I think it's important to understand both the motivations of the actors that are offering this of the beaten tracks tourism, and also the motivations of the tourists that are experiencing these projects. And I will propose here 3 levels of analysis. A first level that takes into account the nature of the actors that promote the of the beaten tracks tourism, tourism stakeholders, of course, but also more generally the urban and cultural, public and private actors. I think that this is very interesting to understand how the term of the beaten tracks is used in public actor discourses. A second level of analysis concerns the motivations and practices of tourists engaged in off the beaten tracks visits or products. Off the beaten track contributes, I think, to the creation of a new mythology of tourism practices. And the question here is, of course, what are the imaginaries related to these practices? What means for tourists to get off? And how these off practices are linked to more conventional tourism experiences. And finally, a third level of analysis deals with the spatial and temporal also dimensions of the beaten tracks. What is, for example, the common denominator between, let's take 2 examples. On the one hand, a new urban destination such as Belfast, now seen by tour operators as the place to be. And here, obviously, we are speaking about a place which, during the last years, was more related to imaginaries of war, of killings, bombings, whatever. So on the one hand, Belfast, and on the other hand, for example, and I will speak about this, some Parisian suburbs, which are located, in fact, at the doorstep of one of the most one of the oldest and the more well-established tourism destinations in the world. So different kind of places, and I think it's important to see what we are really speaking about when we are speaking about this off the beaten tracks tourism. So far from wanting to codify the in and the off by saying this is in or this is off, the aim of my presentation is to draw some conclusions on this kind of transversal subjectivity of this alternative tourism system. Okay, so first of all, who are the actors? Well, the analysis of the discourses, discourses that are incentive, that are sometimes also injective and very often performative. So these discourses about off the beaten tracks tourism are I think, extremely instructive because they allow us to see who is speaking about off-the-beaten-track tourism. And I think that this is quite paradoxical, the fact that we find, in the first place, the more traditional tourism stakeholders. They are probably the first to enter into this alternative tourism market, even if this tourism is a kind of alternative to their own established destination markets. So the off-the-beaten-track becomes a kind of selling point, a kind of distinctive element of new products proposed by established tour operators. Then, of course, we find tour operators that are really specialized on this segment, specialized on off-the-beaten-track tourism. But, and this is more interesting for me, parallel to these tourism initiatives, we find also local public tourism and urban stakeholders that are also promoters, in fact, of tourism off the beaten track. For the public tourism and urban sector, the motivations, in fact, to go off are diverse, but I think that we can here speak about two main motivations. The first one is that these off-the-beaten-track initiatives may allow sometimes to decongest very heavily touristically visited spaces, so very heavily touristified spaces. And this explains why premium tourist destinations such as Paris, London, or Amsterdam develop recently more and more off-the-beaten-track products. And the other reason is also to renew the image of the destinations by offering alternative itineraries and by opening, in fact, new spaces for tourism. And obviously, repeaters are the target market for this off-the-beaten-track tourism. However, and this is, I think, also interesting, all of the off-the-beaten-track initiatives are not proposed by tourism stakeholders. Many other initiatives come from totally different other milieus that some of them are very, very far away from established tourism circles. I mean, associations, they are coming from associations, they are coming from social workers, they are coming from artists, from NGOs, etc., etc. In this context, in fact, the role of the producer, in fact, of the beaten-track experience, so the role, for example, of a local guide, who is not a professional guide, the role of a greeter, the role also of mediator, of intermediary, in fact, is extremely crucial and very, very complex to analyze, but extremely interesting also. Well, this is because, in fact, the tourist nature of these proposed experiences by all those not touristic actors, associations, etc., is not even assumed as such. I mean, these actors, they even refuse to speak that they are producing tourism products. So some of the beaten-track providers refuse even to accept the fact that they are really producing a tourism product, even if, in fact, their proposals clearly meet the interests of tourists and are visited by tourists, which obviously transforms these initiatives into tourism products. And we can, I think, find here this kind of opposition that was very well described by Jean-Didier Urbain, and also defended by Thierry Pacaud, who is a philosopher of urban situations. They make a difference between traveler and tourist, according to these discourses, to which I do not totally agree, but I think they are extremely interesting. So according to these discourses, is as if the off-the-beaten tracks belongs to travelers, not to tourists. This kind of exclusion, in fact, of the tourist by the off-the-beaten-track actors has, I think, also a double dimension. First, it is linked to the figure of the tourist himself. These alternative tourism practices are supposed to be addressed to the brave, to resourceful travelers, to pioneers, not to tourists who is supposed to be a follower. Secondly, it is linked also, partly at least, to the difficult acceptance of the commercial nature of the off-the-beaten tracks experiences. Off-the-beaten tracks is supposed to be authentic, again, of course, in brackets, is supposed to be based on values that are shared between the different parties that take place, in fact, in this experience. And for some of the beaten tracks actors, it is often difficult to accept that a tourism product is supposed to be sold to customers. So this, in fact, brings to speak about the targets of these of the beaten tracks products, which, in fact, can be radically different depending on who is creating and who is proposing these products. In fact, while offers from established tourism stakeholders target mainly an audience of tourists, or eventually secondarily of businessmen or business tourists, whatever, well, this means, at any case, clients. The proposals by associations or NGOs intend, in fact, to open the visit experience, or the experience in general, to publics, not to clients. So there is a big difference between these two approaches. And among these publics to which the association or NGOs of the beaten tracks products are addressed, we can also find local inhabitants. And this is, I think, also something interesting, because we observe here a kind of paradoxical situation. That means that, on the one hand, tourism actors reclaim these everyday life spaces as off-the-beaten-track spaces for tourists. And on the other hand, alternative actors aim, in fact, at enabling the local residents to take again possession of their living spaces, which, from which they have been sometimes excluded by tourists. And, of course, I'm referring here to some famous cases such as Barcelona again, or Berlin, or whatever. So we have a kind of ambiguity here, client versus host, market product versus product offered by this kind of shared experience. And this ambiguity is again reflected by the visits of the greeters I spoke before. It is also, I think, can also be seen, in fact, in a much more ambiguous way in the case of shared apartments or even Airbnb rentals. I guess that all of us here pertinently know that these rental practices are very far away from genuine sharing values. However, Airbnb presents the profiles of the renters as if they were hosts, as if they were the ambassadors of the metropolitan destinations in which their apartments are located. And in fact, they are doing this so well that I think that finally we will believe them. So it appears that, if several actors, touristic or not, promote this off-the-beaten-track tourism, their objectives, their targets, their products present this extreme heterogeneity. And I think that finally this heterogeneity speaks to us, tell us more about the intentions of the actors than about the intrinsic value, nature of the products that are offered. Second point, what? What are, in fact, these off-the-beaten-tracks practices? We have a lot of studies, academic studies, that seem to corroborate the fact that contemporary tourists seek these alternative tourism products, alternative public spaces, creative urban neighborhoods, ethnic neighborhoods, etc., etc. And these studies show that, at least for leisure tourists, probably things are different for business tourism, but for leisure tourists, it is important to meet the locals and to receive or to exchange with them, to receive their advices and their recommendations. So off-the-beaten-track practices are considered by the tourists as authentic, or at least more authentic than the practices of mass tourism. And their authenticity, in fact, is accentuated by their amateurism, and the fact that some of these products are totally amateur, for tourists mean that they are much more authentic. For example, the studies underline the fact that sometimes the total inconsistency of these off-the-beaten-track tourist visits, the fact, for example, that sometimes they are totally out of schedule, the fact that they announce this kind of itinerary and finally they are doing this other kind of itinerary, all this is considered, in fact, by tourists not really as problematic. I mean, it's not considered as a problem. It is considered as a kind of interpretation of their real and authentic nature. So what is interesting for me is, in fact, that when we try to analyze these practices and the way that these practices are evaluated by tourists, we observe a kind of challenge, in fact, of the existing separation between tourists and no tourists, between what a tourist is and between what, we have to do with other practices which are not touristic. Between touristic practices and between everyday life. And in fact, this how can I say, this kind of transversality, it is explained by the fact that, yes, on the one hand, tourists aspire to live as locals. And on the other hand, locals, local inhabitants that sometimes belong to a kind of globalized middle classes, have on the opposite, a kind of cosmopolitan identity, and consciously, in fact, define themselves as citizens of the world. And they often pretend that they can even consume their own city as if they were tourists. So tourist practices are really adopted by everyday life practices of local inhabitants, and on the other hand, tourists, they really aspire to live as a local. So Robert Maitland speaks about a reciprocal transgression that takes place and that finally differentiates tourists from residents as well as touristic from non-touristic areas. However, it would be wrong to think that this differentiation is total. And Maitland very correctly recalls that for visitors, real does not mean real, real means ideal. So when we speak about these places, we speak, of course, about places that they have this kind of intimate morphology and this kind of village feel, in which, of course, we can find the characteristics I showed before. However, tourism practices of the beaten tracks are not only attracted by these trendy areas. They also have an impact on these areas. And I think that this is also something that we have to take into consideration. There is a kind of performativity in these practices. And even if tourists go to some places that they are not that ideal at the moment in which they go there, they contribute into transforming these places into these ideal touristic places. So they promote, in fact, consciously or unconsciously, they promote new space aesthetics because, in fact, they follow or even they anticipate the aesthetic enhancement or the artificialization of these places. So they encourage or they accompany the commodification of the spaces, the artificialization of the spaces, the aestheticization of these places, and obviously the gentrification of these places. Third point, where are these off-the-beaten-tracks areas? Well, we observe that cities that stayed away from national and international tourist fluxes are becoming, during the last years, new destinations and even must-see destinations. And we have a lot of works that show this transformation of Marseille, of Ouch, of Belfast, that they transcended their difficult past, well, as a port city, as an industrial city, as a war city, and they now valorize their brownfields, their industrial and port areas, their social housing projects, or eventually the after effects of the war. So these new destinations, these cities that are becoming new destinations, position themselves on the new tourist map by a kind of poetic transformation of their backyards, of their fringes, and of their suburbs. But off the beaten track tourism does not only concern these new destinations, the new urban destinations, but as I said before, it concerns also metropolitan territories that have remained till recently, we would say, in the shadow of the central business district. And we have now, well, this is an image from Paris, from the 13th district in Paris. So we have new metropolitan of the beaten tracks visits that explore these margins of these places that are geographically very close, in fact, but they are, or they remained till now, till recently, culturally and socially distant, if not even exotic for some of them. And indeed, tourist practices are invented, I think, every day, precisely here, precisely in these metropolitan areas, in these metropolitan margins. Well, these new practices can be alternative accommodation, couch surfing, which is banal today, but we should not forget that it did not exist 10 years ago. Homestays in social housing, this is also something that develops a lot. Interactive visits, participatory visits, greeters, visits also in unusual places, suburban landscapes, underground places, industrial zones that are sometimes turned into cultural factories or whatever. So new practices, and these practices, I think that they contribute to radically change, for example, the imaginary related to social housing. And this is very important because here again, we are not only speaking about tourism, we are speaking about other realities that are transformed by tourism, but concern in a more general way the way that we understand cities today. So they participate, in some other cases, to the heritageization, in fact, of places that previously could not pretend to any heritage status because of tourism gaze. This is tourism gaze that gives them a new status that celebrates precisely, valorizes precisely what was previously regarded as repellent, the danger dimension we spoke before. Well, danger, of course, real or fantasized, this is not the question. The atypical or the uncontrolled nature of these places, the liminality of these places, well, all this becomes an argument that transforms these places into touristic attractions. And I would just say a word, I will not have the time to develop it here, but I have been working a lot on the night tourism, and I would like to say that all this off the beaten track, of course, is not only special, but this is also temporal. And sometimes, I mean, we can speak about off the beaten track in very central touristic areas that are presented totally differently because night transforms, in fact, the reality of these places. Well, so all this analysis, I think that they seem to corroborate the fact that this off the beaten track tourism is not a category of place, of time, or of practices that could ever be been defined in a kind of deterministic way, but is an object of study that really invite us to take into consideration simultaneously the in and the off in their correlation, in fact. This is as if we had these two phases of Janus, the in and the off, speaking about tourism. And we need, in fact, to analyze them in a systematic way and in their reciprocal co-constitution, because ontologically, the center needs the periphery, and the margin, of course, cannot be understood without the center. I will give very, very briefly, and I apologize for this, 2 examples from France. The first one is in Marseille. I guess that you recognize this image here. And this is an initiative that started in 2013, the year that Marseille was cultural capital of Europe. And during this year, Marseille created an urban itinerary, a GR for Grande Randonnée, GR 2013. So an itinerary, a route, an urban route, that crosses the whole metropolitan area. And it passes not only from the nice central urban areas of the city, but it passes also, it goes through more marginal areas, and more precisely these very sadly famous northern districts of Marseille. I think if you know about Marseille, you probably know that all these faits divers used to come from these northern districts. So this is an initiative in which inhabitants, artists, associations, also companies and firms from these northern districts of Marseille invite visitors for a new kind of walk through the social housing, through the metropolitan natural spaces, or through abandoned factories or abandoned places. In a first stage, in 2013, the trail was designed as a frame of projects, in fact, a frame of different projects that were aiming into creating a kind of common culture for the whole metropolitan area. So give the metropolitan area to understand as a whole. And speaking about this metropolitan area, we are speaking about 37 different municipalities, so it's a big territory. So the project in the beginning was contemplative. It was about seeing, visiting, and you see here the nature of the places that are visited. We are, of course, speaking about social housing. In Campagna, béton is the concrete, so it speaks about the nature of monuments that are visited. So in the beginning, the idea was to offer a kind of contemplative visit, but in a second stage, so these are some other places through which passes this itinerary, this trail. But in a second stage, the means now, 2016, the GR 2013 becomes, in fact, a real tool for planning the metropolis. So it changed its nature, and it becomes, in fact, a light structure of urban planning that really traces a physical, a narrative, but also a legal continuity through the whole Marseille metropolis. In this new phase that started in this GR 2013, the idea is to produce also places in which people not only will pass through, here you have a tourist visit, in fact, even if, again, local actors do not accept the fact that they are really producing a tourist product, but here you have tourists. So the idea is also to connect some social housing in order to offer accommodation, homestays in social housing, which is absolutely complicated in France because today it's not legal. So that means that we have to make some changes concerning, in fact, the way that all this can happen. And also this kind of projects that can offer accommodation in these nature spaces around the trail. So this is one example. Just keep in mind, if we have the time, you can again discuss it. The second example that I would like to present you is this association, Baština, that means voyage in Croatian, because the creator was a guy from Croatia. An association of fair trade tourism, as they define themselves, founded in 2010. So this association, in fact, proposes solidarity tourism, and then again, I'm using the terms they use, which, in fact, does not take place in Africa or in Asia, but just at the corner of the street and inside Paris or in the Parisian suburbs. so voyage solidaire à 0 kilometers, in fact. So the idea is here to highlight the cultural diversity and the cosmopolitanism of Paris, and in fact to rely for this on the figure of the migrant itself. So the people who gives these visits are the migrants, the immigrants. So the association works with immigrants as well as with those that work themselves with immigrants, with people that, as they say, carry a cultural universe. They have with them this cultural universe, and they also represent sometimes a living heritage. So the approach takes, of course, a very particular meaning today, because, again, I mean, this is a tourist initiative since we have tourists. But again, they do not accept to speak about tourism. But it's an extremely important initiative today because, of course, of all these issues that Europe faces today. And give, in fact, the floor to an immigrant to speak about his or her own experiences is, of course, it can be a touristic project, but it is also a very political project. So this association implemented urban walks around some neighborhoods. Here is Château Rouge in the 18th district of Paris. And this is one of the most diverse areas in Paris. Visits also with people from Mali, but people from Mali that live in Paris around their culture, their know-how, their everyday life. So these visits, in fact, target visitors that are not only interested about the city, or even they are not interested about the city, they are really interested about the lives of those that live in this city. So the urban promenade, the urban walking that is proposed by Bastina is based precisely on this encounter with the passeur. They speak about passeur. I don't even know how to translate this in English, maybe the in-between. But the people that are in between two cultures, and they can give, in fact, their heritage, their cultural universe to the visitors or to the public. So and in fact, through these visits, I mean, it is possible to visit, for example, a hair salon, to visit a tailor shop. This picture is taken in a tailor shop, which is a very particular, extremely interesting tailor shop in the 18th district of Paris. It is possible also to visit a very traditional pharmacopoeia boutique, a place of worship in a garage, the ongoing work in an atelier, a cafe where old migrants used to go, etc., etc. So every landmark, every particular atmosphere invite, in fact, to exchange with the immigrants. I will present finally very, very quickly. Well, these two initiatives I just presented before, they are really grassroots. They are coming from associations, from local people, and as I said before, they now start to accept that, yes, they could eventually have a touristic interest. Obviously, they do have. But I would like to say that this is interesting to see that on the same time, we also have some much more institutionalized approaches. And I would like to speak to you very briefly about this contrat de destination that, well, again, it's an expression that only exists, I guess, in France, is a kind of contract between stakeholders and the French state. This contrat de destination, there are others about Normandy, about Corsica, in different places in France. This contrat de destination concerns, in fact, the, Paris and the districts around Paris. So, I'm sorry. So these three districts I show here, which are a small part, in fact, of the Parisian region of the Île-de-France. So here, between the partners, we have the Tourism Office of Paris, also the state agency that runs the underground, le métro, because all these places are supposed to be visited by local and public transportation. Also these three departments. Our institute, we are very happy to be part of this contract, and also some other local stakeholders. And I'm showing you here this map, which took several years to be implemented. It looks very banal, but in fact, you have here, for the first time, it was produced some months ago, for the first time, you don't have a differentiation between Paris intramuros and the outskirts. So this is the périphérique that separates the in from the out, the in from the off. And for the first time, the idea is now to offer a big Paris to tourists. So the idea is, in fact, to decongestion these very heavily places of the hyper-touristic center of Paris, but also the idea is to offer an alternative image for Paris, because Paris is considered today by local actors, by local stakeholders, as a kind of very classic, very traditional, very old-fashioned destination. So the idea is to bring young people, mainly from Europe, and mainly, again, repeaters. Okay, so what is, I think, interesting is that this very institutional initiative works a lot with the other associations I presented before, for example, with Bastina, and Bastina is one of the main associations that participate to this project. So we do have this kind of interrelation that sometimes is very, very complex, even if, again, all these actors are supposedly, well, they believe that they are not doing the same job. They believe they are not working for the same objective, which is obviously also true. Okay, as a conclusion, I will put here this diapositive that I think is very nice. So as a conclusion, I will try to open some questions. Well, it seems that, in fact, the most banal everyday life places of some people can become the most exotic places for others. And their characterization means banal, everyday, exotic, invites us, in fact, to operate a kind of continuous back and forth analysis between all these different worlds that are crossed by tourists while is practicing off the beaten track tourism. That means that we have to take into consideration continuously the in and the off. So a first conclusion is this need, in fact, to take into account the experiences of a tourist as a continuum and not in an isolated way. The exotic, in fact, suburban social housing rooms in Marseille represent the everyday life of their inhabitants. And if the fringes of some metropolitan areas give chills to those who visit them, they have per se nothing remarkable for those who live there. So the off-the-beaten-track tourism lies fundamentally on this kind of gap, that a tourist can create himself between his everyday or her everyday life place and his or her tourist practices. However, speaking about gap, we have to say, I guess, that it's not possible for everybody to experience this gap. It is, for example, very rare to see socially fragile groups spending their holidays in a chateau. And obviously, for them, spending their holidays in a chateau could represent an off-the-beaten-track tourism experience. So, off-the-beaten-track tourism experience is socially determined, and off-the-beaten-track experiences concern more, if not exclusively, middle or upper classes who have really this ability to transcend a very comfortable everyday living status in order to spend, for example, a night on a nice mattress in an igloo, or a night in a tent in the desert, or in a vintage mattress in a former jail. I saw this in Quebec. Or eventually in a social housing in Marseille. This kind of tourist graal, the tourist graal which is really to pass to the other side of the mirror. This tourist GRAR, in fact, only belongs, only is possible for the tourists that really control, through, in fact, their social, cultural, and touristic capital, they can control all these experiences, all these very complex codes that allow them really to get to the other side of the mirror. So a second conclusion is that off-the-beaten-track tourism invites to enter into a kind of distinction game in which everyone does not participate equally. And paradoxically enough, mass tourism is clearly much more egalitarian for those that is practicing mass tourism. Off-the-beaten-track can be really excluding as form of tourism. Well, the question has to be probably differently from the point of view of the local inhabitants, which of course represent a major challenge for off-the-beaten-track tourism, because this kind of tourism aims, firstly, at being socially sustainable. It focuses, in fact, on the respect of local populations and of the environment quality of these local populations. However, here again, we do have, I think, a slight problem, because some analyses show that a large majority of inhabitants of, for example, the northern districts of Marseille, I took as example before, are much more the objects of the visit than the real actors of the visit, even if this visit is done by local associations and local actors. Other studies showed, for example, that the visits to these wall frescoes in Belfast are not always understood by local inhabitants. Local people may feel sometimes that some external actors may exploit their image or even their identity. And we do have a lot of cases in which visitors have been insulted or molested by local inhabitants. So a third conclusion is that if tourists want to get off this kind of tourist bubble of mass tourism enclaves, or even if they want to play the role of the local, as a local, and they are invited to do so by off-the-beaten-track, in fact, actors, well, we can see that local inhabitants do not always, at least, understand, do not always accompany, and do not always endorse these new practices. Okay, so what are we talking about when we're speaking about off-the-beaten-track tourism? Obviously, these off-the-beaten-track situations, they do really, well, this is a question. Let me put it as a question. Do these off-the-beaten-track situations simply witness about a kind of continuing widening of the tourist ecumen? It is in English the same. Okay, the tourist ecumen, which of course started from the beginnings of the tourism, and it was expressed by all these generations of tourists that always wanted to go more and more away, further and further. So is this about just a widening of existing things, or is it about the introduction of a new reality? Do they introduce, in fact, a total reinvention of the tourist phenomenon by the emergence, in fact, of new transversal situations that totally transcend their tourist nature in order, in fact, to produce new realities that cannot or should not be qualified as touristic anymore. To ask the question differently, are these places in which we can find these off-the-beaten-track initiatives, are they post-touristic? To take again the analysis I presented at the beginning of my speech, do they go really beyond the tourism by the invention of new products and new practices that cannot be qualified as touristic anymore? Or are they hyper-touristic, means a kind of extreme sophistication of this tourism phenomena expressed by a total individuation, by total segmentation, by total disintermediation? I'm sorry for these complex and barbarian words. So to go back to France and try to, not to give an answer, but at least eventually say how we could eventually give an answer. So to go back to France, because I presented here some French marginal initiatives, I have, however, to remind that if we are speaking about real tourism statistics, well, in fact, we still have more than 9 million visitors for Le Louvre. We still have more than, well, almost 7 million visitors for La Tour Eiffel. And we have more than 7 million visitors for Versailles. That means that tourism icons, they really are doing pretty well. So mass tourism obviously has a huge future. So it's not about contesting mass and alternative tourism. But, and this is my last sentence, because I see Alessia is doing some kind of mimics. Last sentence, I think that in parallel with these realities, which obviously are important, because speaking about tourism in France, again, we are speaking about Tour Eiffel, Versailles, La Cathédrale Notre-Dame, etc., etc. So parallel with these huge visitor numbers, of the beaten tracks tourism really produces and designs new urban territories, new urban realities. You notice that they only spoke here about urban situations. And I think that this is not really antagonistic with mass tourism. It's a kind of complementary product. And I think that more than a post-touristic situation, they witness about a total hyper-touristic situation, which is really marked by the exacerbation, by the generalization of this total transversality of the tourism phenomena in our not really postmodern, but hyper-modern society. Thank you so much. I'm sorry for being long. You're hungry, are you?
Thank you so much,
Sorry.
Maria. Thank you.
But I started later.
Yeah. 10 minutes later. Yeah. Are there any questions? I have at least 3 or 4 of them. But yeah, please, Mihalis.
Thank you very much, Maria. Not only I thought it was a great presentation, I also think it summarizes the conference very appropriate presentation for the conference. So I thought it was fantastic. But just because I'm trying to think of the paper we're going to write together from now on, I imagine it like it's the following. You argue that we are in this era of post or beyond or hyper tourism, and then there comes exactly the same observations in exactly the same places, and I argue that we are not beyond, we are back to real tourism, because mass tourism enclaves are not real tourism in the sense that tourism is an activity that is supposed to transform the tourist and promote, you know, what we say, cultural understanding. You know, a huge hotel in Cancun, where all British people seem to go, does not do that. They just go and keep drinking the beer they are drinking at home, just with some sunshine. And they do the same in Greece and Spain and Italy and everything. So that's not tourism. The real tourism is this, where you go and experience really and you understand the world better. Would you disagree totally? Is that another way of presenting what you're saying,
Well,
or is it totally irrelevant?
I
That's the
disagree, and I'm not sure that we will be able to write the paper together.
That's the other.
But to say things for me, well, what means first real tourism? For me, real tourism is what happens when people think that believe they are tourists and they are practicing tourism. Yes. And I do have a lot of respect for those people that goes in Cancun and that they come to Greece. And I don't really believe that they don't exchange, they don't understand, they don't see anything. I think this is really underestimating them. And I don't think that they deserve it. So I don't know what... I don't know what real tourism is. Are you speaking also about this difference between tourism and travel? About tourists and travelers? Yeah, Well, this is a very, I think this is a very academic position, and also very elitistic, very light position also.
I've been to Cancun, don't get me wrong, right?
Oh, I know. Obviously, first you go and then you criticize. This is always, yeah, it was always like that. So we will see for the paper. We can negotiate.
Any other questions?
Yes. Thank you very much. Sylvia Dimorti from Aalborg University, Denmark. Thank you for a fantastic presentation. But when I was listening to you, I cannot help becoming a bit skeptic about the implicit moral agenda underlying your analysis. Is that non-commercial, inconspicuous and untypical tourist experiences are more fair? That you are implying that those living local experiences are better, and we are creating value on a wider basis than what is possible in tourism enclaves. So I would like to challenge you on that. How are we going to study the consequences of this moral alternative of the beaten track tourism in rigorous ways when you are dissolving the categories that we are used to have in tourism analysis?
Yes. Well, my approach is the approach of a researcher, so I'm trying to understand how things happen. I'm not in a position, I don't think that I can be in this position to say that this is better than this. I do believe that there are a lot of initiatives that are really excellent because, from my point of view, because in fact they are producing some urban, cultural, social, political realities. And I think that these social, political realities are today extremely important. Are they really interesting in terms of tourism? I'm not sure about this. They are touristic, and this is one point which is important to say, and even this, for me, is a big argument when I speak with the guys from Bastina, who I'm trying to explain them, you are doing tourism. I say, no, we are not doing it. Yes, we are doing tourism. Yes, we are doing tourism, and accept it, and eventually valorize it. So I'm not sure that this is really good tourism, but I think that in terms of how can I say, of empowerment of these passeurs, of these guides that are really doing the visit, is an excellent and very interesting initiative. But of course, I mean, always you have this kind of double reality, and we cannot, in fact, how can I say, les accusés, accuse them. Huh? We cannot accuse them because, in fact, it happens that this social approach is also extremely interesting for the market. It is. I mean, obviously, this is a big success. These visits are a big success because it's a kind of new product, because, in fact, they allow to see these other places of Paris, and you know pretty well, a lot of you here, that if you've been to Paris 2, 3, 4 times, okay, the 5th time or the 4th time, sometimes you need to visit something different. And so this is a very, very interesting proposal. So, of course, I mean, it can be, it has a sense, a meaning in terms of market. But, well, this was not the point in the beginning. I'm not sure that I answered to your question, but no, I did.
Yes, thank you. Maybe we, I'm curious, of course, about the urban part. And I'm amazed, alarmed, shocked, hopeful, and worried about the Marseille development to build social housing, not for people, but for tourists. And I know there are people, but then it's not the case.
No, sorry, probably I was not clear. This social housing is not built for tourists. This is real social housing. But today in France, if you are in a social housing, you cannot, for example, offer one room through Airbnb or other providers. So the idea is to open this social housing in order to allow these encounters with the tourists. Okay. So it's not a transformation of social housing. But obviously, even this possibility to open this room, who is, in fact, I mean, you are a renter, you are not the owner of this social housing, the fact to open it to visitors today is impossible in France because of law. So I think that this initiative, well, as far as I'm concerned, again, this is a personal point of view, I think that this initiative is excellent. Be able, in fact, at least, I mean, if you live in an apartment, you are supposed to have the same rights that any other people living in any other kind of apartment.
This is social housing law.
Yes.
It's not for all houses, for all apartments. It's the law that forbids you to...
No. You have a lot of regulations, of course, now for Airbnb, for example. In Paris, you have a lot of new regulations that really try to control this phenomenon of Airbnb. But this is a different kind of things.
Okay. But so it's a larger question. It was just a hint, but my question is if you think that on an urban planning or urban level, there's tourism is impacting the democratic structures, because it seems like it aids to generate something that used to be a welfare thing and now is profit oriented when it's with tourism, and then it can generate something that people need, be they tourists or not.
Okay. Well, this is an excellent question, but this is another paper. This is an excellent question. I think that we should work on these issues here. Well, I can give you a double answer. Obviously, I've been several times in Berlin. We were invited by the mayoress of Kreuzberg, and obviously he spoke about these problems. And for her, I mean, these questions, I mean, tourism in these neighborhoods in Berlin really puts a problem in terms of local democracy. This is one point. On the other hand, I start seeing some initiatives in which, for example, in complicated political situations in some countries, tourists are invited to take part and to be the allies, in fact, of local people. So I think that we are now, and this is extremely interesting for me, which way a tourist can be considered as a citizen outside of his own country and behave as a citizen, if he's a renter in an Airbnb or if he takes part against a political regime in a country that he or she visits. But this is a huge issue.
Another question? Oh, okay, perfect. Hello, and sorry everybody if I'm delaying you from lunch. Thanks. Thank you very much again for your presentation. I found it really fascinating. I was just wondering, are there any concerns by the people in these communities on whether these off-the-beaten-track types of tourism can end up becoming extremely commoditized? And because this is how tourism started in many places. Essentially, people having a room and making it available to tourists, not in a very professionalized way, but it was more like a kind of a hospitality, host-guest interaction. And eventually this led to much more professionalized approaches. So I was wondering, are there any concerns about where this is going, especially since you mentioned that already there are some concerns that maybe the objects, people become the objects of these tours?
Yes. Well, yes, clearly. There are a lot of concerns, of course. And there is not, I mean, in these situations, when you involve so many different stakeholders, you cannot find a total consensus. I think this ideal situation in which you may achieve this consensus, for me, cannot exist. The example of Marseille I gave, yes, it's a kind of conflictual problem, because situation. Because obviously, I mean, the intentions are the best of the world. And here, in the beginning, again, the idea was really to create this kind of coherence of the metropolitan area and try, well, the main message was to say, okay, this is the same metropolis. And you cannot have here the nice areas and here, in fact, this totally neglected, dangerous, and with this extreme negative imagination, in fact, burden of these northern districts. So in the beginning, the intention was excellent. And it still works. It still allows to bring together different social actors of these areas. But I mean, we are speaking about areas in which social housing, urban areas, abandoned urban areas, in which you have totally different populations. I mean, obviously, the guy that believes that lives there and that suffers from this negative image will collaborate. But obviously, the dealer will not. Because for the dealer, I mean, this is a problem, this new trail. So it's very, very difficult, in fact, to have this kind of consensus. And obviously, you do have a lot of tension and a lot of opposition in this project. Bastina is different. It's different because it's much more light, in fact. So there are small visits, there are small, and in fact, those that are presenting, they are presenting their families, their friends, the places in which they work. So it's a much more a greater approach. So it's much less conflictual.
Thank you again, Maria.
You're
Thank you
very
so
welcome.
much.